You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
We will close the book on firearms talk for today and move on to an issue that I find to be a fascinating one, because internalized hatred of your own country has become this real epidemic in Canada. One of the things we love doing here is importing American cultural battles. So when the George Floyd protests were waging in the United States, Canada also became very introspective. And we started to see all of these accusations that were based on these things that didn't quite make sense to a lot of people. Like, Canada is a deeply systemically racist country. But this wasn't just being shouted by a bunch of rabid left-wing activists. This was actually embedded in Justin Trudeau's mandate letters to his ministers. In December 2021, he put this following line in his ministerial mandate letters: profound systemic inequities and disparities that remain present in the core fabric of our society, including our core institutions. We've had the RCMP commissioner forced to testify on the stand of a parliamentary committee to the RCMP being filled with systemic racism. We've seen the Department of National Defense talk about how Canada's foundations have a white supremacy woven into them, the fabric of Canadian society. So is Canada a systemically racist country, and what does that mean? Well, our friends at the Aristotle Foundation, specifically Matthew Lau, did a deep dive into it, and they looked at a number of key metrics and found that, in fact, not at all is this accusation true. Joining me is the founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation, Mark Milke. Mark, good to talk to you as always, sir. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on, Andrew.
So let's start off firstly with why the Aristotle Foundation went into this issue in the first place, and why Matthew did this study.
Sure. Well, for years, as you've pointed out, we've heard this notion that Canada is systemically racist, institutionally racist, and you have to unpack that. You can meet bigots anywhere, any age. But I wrote in this some time ago in my last book, The Victim Cult. Matthew wrote about it in a chapter for the 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Canceled. And you and I talked about that, as did Matthew a couple of months ago, that chapter. But this accusation that Canada is systemically racist really needs to be unpacked. And you mentioned American influence a moment ago. Well, Thomas Sowell has done a lot of great analysis in this United States, right? But we found that there wasn't a lot of good analysis kind of challenging this narrative, that United States in Sowell's case, or Canada in this case, is systemically racist. And I can tell you some of the research I did in my previous book and that Matthew has done shows it's nonsensical. As one example, Ontario in the early 1950s began to pass laws against discrimination based on gender or ethnicity in the early 1950s for accommodation, for employment, that sort of thing. Prior to the 1950s, if you were Black or if you were a woman, you may be denied accommodation or a certain job. Post early 1950s, 70 years ago, that was outlawed. So what Matthew has done in a new paper for the Aristotle Foundation is unpack this even more.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's important to point out here is that no one is saying that racism does not exist in Canada. There are individual racists, there are individual racism incidents, but when you say systemic racism, that carries a lot of weight, because you're saying that it's embedded in institutions, it's baked into institutions. And how do you go about disproving that? How do you go about proving the negative in a way that, systemic racism is not present?
Well, first of all, start to define it clearly. So you read the definitions from the federal government at the outset of the show. And what you have to do is unpack that again. So systemic racism literally does an institution discriminate against you because of your color, your gender, this sort of thing. We have clear examples in history. If you were Jewish at a certain point in Canadian and American history, you might not have been allowed into certain colleges, or at least not above a certain percentage of the population. Chinese people in San Francisco were not allowed at white hospitals because they were white. The Chinese of San Francisco literally had to set up their own hospitals. That was institutional discrimination. Pre-1960s in the American South, you could not be on the bus at the front of the bus. If you were Black, you had to be at the back. The system, the institution literally discriminated against you, whether it's a hospital, a busing authority, a landlord, so on and so forth. But much of that has been outlawed for 60 or 70 years. So that's very different than meeting a bigot on the street today, who may be anti-Semitic, by the way. That seems to be the latest popular prejudice out there, which should be attacked. So you can meet bigots, but that's not the same thing as saying the system is rigged against you. So what Matthew does in his paper for the Aristotle Foundation asking about this question, and you can find it at aristotlefoundation.org, is he compares incomes, for example, and says, okay, if we're actually a systemically racist society, shouldn't that show up in the data? So, as one example, he goes to Statistics Canada and he uses the data that tries to equalize for people that work full year, full time, look at income by ethnicity. Well, what does he find? If you've got skin color like me and you, Andrew, we're in the middle of the pack, right? Males or females, and you find some portions of ethnic Canada, if you're Japanese Canadian or Korean Canadian, if that's your ancestry, you've actually got higher weekly average earnings, or median earnings rather. So that matters because, as Matthew points out in his paper for the Aristotle Foundation, do you say, for example, that if you're, say, Latin American in some cases and your income is lower than the average white Canadian, does that mean somehow the system is rigged against you as a Latin American but not as a Korean Canadian or a Chinese Canadian? So he brings up the absurdity again of this claim. You'd think, for example, that white Canadians should have incomes that are higher than anybody else if this claim is true. So what Matthew does is he goes through this, and he also uses some other interesting stats. So, for example, South Asian Canadians make up about 8% of the working age population. But he finds they make up something like, I think it was 19% of physicians in the country, or engineers rather, and he's other statistics to that effect. So again, if the claim is that there's an institutional bias against certain minority Canadians, I despise that term, but certain Canadians who are considered minorities by the government, you'd expect that consistently in the data for incomes or jobs, that you would find minority Canadians at the bottom of the pack. But Asian Canadians, for example, do incredibly well, which is a good thing in incomes and assets, in degrees. And that's something Matthew tries to point out as well, including, by the way, for Indigenous Canadians, that if you have an education, a bachelor's degree, for example, as an Indigenous Canadian, you make almost as much as any other Canadian. And if you have a slightly higher than a bachelor's degree, maybe a master's degree, you will actually make $2,000 more working full year, full time as an Indigenous Canadian than a non-Indigenous Canadian. So again, Matthew unpacks this notion that Canada is systemically racist. Again, institutions literally discriminating. And I think that's an important tight point to make that Matthew does in his paper.
Well, and one of the things that I wondered when I was first started out reading this is if a big part of the problem has been that equality of outcome has been pushed by a lot of people more than equality of opportunity. And that, in Canada, we do not have any, direct systemic racial barriers that work against people of color, that unless someone wishes to correct me. Now, there are some positions that we see that are for jobs that, are specifically for those people and not for white people. And, whether affirmative action is right or wrong, people can determine for themselves. But if there are disparities that are coming about on an outcome side, they don't seem to be caused by anything that the institutions themselves have set up.
No, and in fact, they're related to other factors such as education or geography. And a good example is First Nations reserves. The average or median First Nation income, again, when you don't do the apple to apple comparison, right? Full time, full year, bachelor's degree, that sort of thing. When you don't do those comparisons, yeah, the averages and medians look a lot lower than other Canadians. But why is that? Because a greater proportion of First Nations people or Indigenous people live in remote areas, often on reserves, where there's not great access to education, at least higher education. There's not great access to great jobs. That makes a difference, as does the average education level, which is lower for Indigenous Canadians vis-a-vis other Canadians. So education makes a difference. But the American economist Thomas Sowell has a wonderful example explaining the folly of saying everyone should have an equal outcome, or every group should, and if it's not, then it must be due to racism. He talks about how historically Italians dominated the fishing fleet worldwide, unlike the Swiss. Does this mean the fishing industry is systemically biased and racist against the Swiss? And Thomas Sowell makes the obvious point. No, it's because the Swiss don't have coastlines. The Italians have coastlines. Of course, growing up around the coast will help you know how to fish and get involved in the fishing sector. And then you emigrate from Italy over the last 100 years, you're going to dominate the fishing fleets around the world because of that experience. At least for a country that has lots of immigrants, as Italy did for 100 years, outpouring of immigrants. So that explains again, or helps explain, that you're not going to have equal outcomes. Or the other example, as Sowell points out, which Matthew notes as well, and I have in my work. Look, families. I have 3 siblings. We don't have equal outcomes. We had the exact same environment growing up. But people vary widely in outcomes despite exactly similar upbringings. So to blame everything on racism, as people do, or mostly on racism, is simplistic to the extreme.
The paper you can read at AristotleFoundation.org, and there's also lots of other good stuff there you should check out. The founder of that, Mark Milke, joins us. Mark, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.